Alright, so in the last video I went over abstract classes, but now we'll start talking about interfaces and how to create one. So what is an interface? An interface is a type where we can implement abstract methods, properties, and method implementations. So it sounds pretty much very similar to an abstract class. By default, everything defined in an interface is abstract, unlike the abstract class where everything is by default non-abstract. So let's create one. Let's create a maintenance interface. This is so that we can check the current status of our building in regards to maintenance for either a tenant, or maybe you just have a regular house and you want to check the status of a specific problem that you're having. So let's create new Kotlin class /file, and then we'll just do building maintenance. I hope I spelled that properly. And then we're going to choose interface, and boom, now we have an interface. It's literally just the interface keyword and the name of the interface. So now let's start defining some properties and functions. So the first one I'm going to have is going to be called file, and then I'm going to put maintenance status. So it can either be pending, or it can be completed, so that's a string. But like I said, by default anything created in an interface is abstract. So if I try to assign it as an empty string, it's not possible, because by default it's not allowed in interfaces because it's abstract. So whoever the subclass that inherits from this interface will be able to implement it by overriding it. And because it's abstract, it's open, so you'll be able to override it. So before, I talked about how interfaces and abstract classes are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. Like I said, properties in the interface by default is abstract, and by default abstract keywords are open by default. A class can extend many interfaces, but like I discussed in the previous video, an abstract class can only be inherited once. But we can create a training effect if needed. An interface does not store state, so as you guys saw that we tried to give it a value, but because it's abstract, it doesn't allow us to do it. But if you're going to return the same value all the time, if you really want to return a specific value, you could use the getter that we learned in the getter and setter video. So you could just do this, or open a string. You could do this and set the getter to an empty string, but for the most part you'll just be overriding it. But if you really want to have a value, then you use the getter. Because an interface is not a class, it's a type, it does not have a primary constructor. So we can't just put parentheses over here and accept the value, because it's not going to allow for that. Interfaces do not have a constructor. Alright, so now we'll start defining some methods within this interface. So let's create a method that will print out the status of maintenance. So let's put prompt status, and now we created an abstract method within this interface, but we are allowed to have normal methods. So we just got to open it up, provided a body, and now this is just a normal method. It's not abstract, and it doesn't need to be overridden. So let's just create a prompt, and we're going to print out the status. So we're just going to put status, and then use some string templating. And I'm pretty sure I have a misspelling somewhere. Maintenance. So I'm just gonna copy this. Maintenance status. Alright, cool. So now when the maintenance status is overwritten, if we try to use prompt status, then it'll print out the current status. But because it is not open, we cannot override it. So if we do want to override it, we could put open. But if you don't, and you just want to print out the prompt status, then you can just do it based on the maintenance status that you override, the value that you override maintenance status with. So now let's see it in action. Let's inherit this. So we're going to go all the way back to building. We're going to put a comma after this. we're going to put building maintenance. It's going to show the squiggly like before, where it's saying that you have some abstract property that needs to be implemented. So we can just override it. And in this building, I am going to place it right under here. Open, or actually override maintenance status. And we can use the getter, but we're not. We're just going to allow for it to be overwritten. So it's going to say that you need to initialize it. We're going to make this equal to an empty string. But now this is accessible in apartment. So if we want to go into apartment, because it's inheriting from building. So this is the effect. So we got this interface, which is, put into building because we want to know the maintenance of this building, the current status. So we inherit from this interface. And now you see that everything is lit up because we inherited building maintenance within building. So now all those properties are available within here, but because apartment is inheriting from building, apartment has access to those properties as well. So if we want to pass that in, we can override maintenance status, put that, and then go back into the main, and then we can put it right before here. So I'll just put pending and put a comma. So now if I do apartment dot building prompt, no, not building prompt, dot, let me see, maintenance, no, the prompt status, there it is. And I'm just gonna print comment out these print statements. If I run this, I should expect to see status, and then it should have the status that we provided, which is pending. So on a bigger scale, we'll probably make a map, which would have another map within this with each tenant, and each tenant will have their own version of maintenance status, because everybody in the building should have their own status for an apartment, because every apartment room has different problems. So in a bigger scale, you probably take the maintenance status that we're taking from the building maintenance interface and provide it inside of this map. And we could probably make another object called tenants and pass that in inside of a map. So there's a lot of things that you can do, but on a simpler scale, that's pretty much how to use an interface, how to create properties. Some can be either abstract, or you can have a method that is non-abstract. That can be overwritten, but it can have a default value that we use, which we're using now, which is taking the maintenance status that we override, and the value that's being passed from apartments is being used to print out the status here. So there's a lot of ways you can play around with interfaces, but yeah, and you're not just restricted to just using one interface. You can use many. So now let's create another interface that will hold information, properties, methods regarding building staff. So we can know who works for our apartment, and what's their ID and what's their name. So we'll create another interface, and Kotlin class/file. We're gonna call this building staff. Make it as an interface. Now let's start defining some properties. So we're gonna make this a map. So let's do val, and then we're gonna do staff, or building staff. We're gonna make this a map of string, or actually we'll just do ID and the name. So we'll do int and string. If you guys want to make it more difficult, you could create another object called employee and have that as the second option instead of string, and then you can dive in deeper on the employee. So you can create properties for the employee, like name, description on what they do, their role. So that's an option, but I'm just gonna keep it simple and have an int for the ID and string for the name, and yeah, that'll be it. And that is our first abstract property, because by default, like I said before, all properties by default in an interface is abstract. So now I'll just create another, or I create a method that will tell me how many staff members I have. So we'll just create a function called amount of staff, capital S, camel case, and then open up parentheses and open up the body, because we are able to have abstract and non-abstract methods. So in this case, I want to create a method with a implementation. So I'll just create a prompt that will take the size of my building staff and return it. So we'll just do amount of staff is, and then do some string templating, open that up, and then building staff dot size. And now whenever we override this building staff with some members of our staff, or if there's no staff, then when we use the amount of staff, when we print this out, it'll just print out the size of the staff. And then you can create another method, and that'll be homework. Create another method that iterates to the staff, or you can do like I did before, get the index of the staff member and then use it to print out the staff. Or if there's no staff, then it'll print out there is no staff by the ID. And that's some little homework for you. But all right, then we'll go back into building, and now that we have another interface, all we got to do is put in a comma and then put the name of the interface that we just created, which is building staff. All right, and you are able to inherit multiple interfaces, but the squiggly line is saying, okay, you have some abstract properties or an abstract method that needs to be implemented. So we'll just create an override here for building staff, right, and then we'll just make this an empty map, because right now we don't want to implement it here. We want to implement it in our next subclass. So we'll just have it empty here. And like I said before, you can inherit multiple interfaces, but you can only inherit one abstract class. So now let's go to our final subclass that's inheriting building, and here I will allow for the creation of employees. And right here I want to create another private var, and I'm going to call this employees, or staff. Let's call it staff. And I'm gonna make this a map of, and then I'm gonna make this an int and a string. All right, and then this dot, but I gotta make staff so I can pass it in, but make that equal to staff, and we should be good to go. All I gotta do is add it. Let me make it right next to this tenants, so I'll just call it staff, and I'll make this a map, and it'll be the same thing, int and a string. Now if I go back into our main, I now have to implement that map, and I'm just gonna make one person, so 1 2, and I'm gonna name the staff member Bobby Bossman. I'm really bad at making fake names, but then we have access to, even though we didn't override, or we don't have the value here, we still have access to the interface, because we're inheriting from building. And if you go back to building, that's inheriting from building staff, and if you go back to building staff, I still have this amount of staff. I have access to this. So if I go to apartment dot, and then I should be able to see amount of staff, and go down, select that. Now if I run this, I'll keep this so you guys still see the prompt status. So now I should see the current value is 200,000, which is the first print from our initial tutorial. But then there's the status, which is pending, which is the second print, and then there's the amount of staff, which is 0. Whoa, wait a minute. We made a mistake, and I'm gonna keep this in because I want to know why exactly is this not working. So we have staff, and we're passing that to staff right here. We're making this staff equal to staff, and okay, we didn't override. We did not override to actually assign it staff. So we can do that here. Let's override, and it'll just be building staff. So instead of it being staff, it'll be building staff. And now we should be good to go. Now if we run this from the main, it should say 1. So that's a very simple mistake to make. You do have to override the values that you're inheriting from, and because there's no implementation yet. So that was the mistake to make. But now you guys know. You can have multiple interfaces, and pretty much created that chaining effect. We have building, which inherits from building interface. So we have our properties and our method. Go back to building. You can override it. Put some default values in here. But then if I go back to apartment, I can override that again and place in the value that I want to use. And then I can assign that to my internal property, which is staff. So, but that's just going to be equal to the building staff. So thank you guys for watching.